Well, hello everyone. It's so wonderful once again to be able to have Pastor Richard Crompton from Word of Faith Christian Center in Gqeberha, Port Elizabeth. He was a great hit on the Company of Prophets a few months ago. And so welcome to this podcast, Pastor Richard. Won't you just greet everyone?
I thank you for having me. It's a tremendous privilege to be with you, Janet, and someone who really has spoken words over our city and they've come to pass. So anything I can do for you, I will.
Thank you. And I'm so excited about our partnership. And here is a man of God. Not only is he a man of God, a pastor, leading pastor in the nation, he's an advocate. He works for South Africa, which he will give us a little bit of more information about. But tell us a little bit about your background, how you became a minister. Obviously, I know your father very well, knew your dad very well, and so you have that heritage, but you also had to choose to step into ministry and choose the path that you're on as now.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. My dad, mom and dad have been pastors my whole life. My dad was a pastor in Cape Town. He took over from my grandfather who built a church in Plumstead called Bethel. And in 1976, he took a call to Port Elizabeth, as it was then, Gqeberha now. And he came and the Lord really used him. My grandparents, what's interesting is my grandmother used to, with her prayer partner, used to laugh in the spirit way back in the 1960s even, we saw that in the 80s and late 80s and 90s with Rodney Howard-Browne, also from our church, but all the way back then. Anyway, so they really moved in the Holy Spirit. We were in an Afrikaans denomination, the one of only two English churches in it. And at that time, English people weren't so popular with some of some other parts of the country. And so my dad started making waves. He started praying for the sick and getting healed, got onto the front page of the paper. And my grandfather had been an AFM pastor, and when they moved to the new church, where they started the new church, he was part of it. Part of the thing was that each congregation owned their own land. So then they passed an edict, because my dad had run evangelical films in 1978, and from then on we were a mixed race congregation. So way back, and of course this didn't sit well with the powers that be. In fact, one of our youth pastors, I know for a fact, worked as informer for the military intelligence. We only found that out years later. I actually think another one of them did as well. But they came down like a ton of bricks on my dad and the denomination. They tried to. They passed an edict that they were taking all the land over. My dad tried to move the church out because he wanted to stay in because my dad was an incredibly loyal man in the denomination, and still move in the spirit and still have a multiracial congregation. But they didn't. So then they took him to court. They brought all kinds of court cases against him. They even arranged for him to be arrested on a trumped-up fraud charge, but this is how we know it's politically motivated. He was arrested by someone from the murder and robbery squad and taken to where the riot squad was. So it was sadly political. I think we were a bit naive at the time. And then he was dragged through the courts by his heroes, people that he used to even mimic after, he was so in awe of them. They dragged us through the courts. And so I was very anti the ministry. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, and Rodney Howard-Browne saying to me, "I see that your life, you're going into the ministry." And he was like 18 or 19 or 21 years old. I was young. I said, never, I'm never going into the ministry ever. And so my parents did well. They gave me absolute leeway. And so I went off to university. A guidance counselor said, did some counseling with me and said, you should do law. And I'd thought of doing all kinds of crazy things, including accounting and being a war photographer. And so I listened to her. She had dream catchers and everything, but the Holy Spirit used her. And so I studied law, and I was made to do law. I think I always thought, from the way you think and what you have to do just suited me. And so I became a lawyer. I lectured constitutional law for 10 years and practiced all at the same time. And then my dad, then I was the last white male. I was the last white male in at the university. So I could see that I needed to go. And so they paid me a retrenchment package because my dad wanted me to come into the ministry to help him with structure. And so I felt to do that. The Lord had done a big repair job in my life by then, as far as the ministry, because what happened was that I was, after school, I would call myself only slightly saved. And I ended up, and my mother twisted my arm. They were starting a new youth group, and they said, you need to go. And so I sort of acquiesced. And they had another lovely guy that could play the guitar, and that lined up to be the youth leader. He never pitched up the first week. I ended up having to run the meeting. The second week, he didn't pitch up. I ran the meeting again. The third week, he pitched up, and then he never pitched up again. And much to everybody's horror, I ended up running the youth. And so while I was studying, I ran our Word of Faith youth. And then a guy actually pushed me out of youth. He was insecure for various reasons, and he wanted me out, and he managed to wrinkle me out of youth. And so I went off and started connect groups, because I believe very strongly in small groups. And so then I worked for my dad for a long time, about 10 years. And then by then everyone had decided I was the one. It took me many years to agree with them. And eventually, when my dad passed away, I stepped in, and he passed away at 3 a.m. And by 8 the next morning, 8:30, I was preaching, took over. So it's a seriously windy road that got me to where I am now.
Well, in a way, it was divinely orchestrated, if you could put it in those.
Very much so.
And God was preparing you right from your early days. I mean, for what you're involved in today. I haven't met many pastors and leaders who actually are practicing advocates. So tell us a little bit about your work in the legal fraternity, and how are you doing private work? I know you work for Force South Africa.
Yeah. So I've always practiced part-time, although at times it's looked like full-time. And so I got involved. So I've practiced a lot of criminal law for a long time, some very intense matters. One that actually got me onto national German TV, a big criminal matter. And then I've done quite a lot of constitutional and administrative legal matters. Since lockdown, I've mostly been doing admin and constitutional law. I was involved in the team that got ivermectin legalized. We did some work and still doing some work on vaccinations. And so I've because of my constitutional law, lecturing it for 10 years, and I found that interpreting the Constitution is I found it easy to do. A lot of people don't. And I think it's because of my years of reading the Bible, because you have to read the Bible holistically.
Yes.
So you don't take one scripture. The famous story of the lucky dip. The guy opened the Bible and it said, we wanted direction, and it said, and Judas went and hung himself. So I opened the Bible again, and it said, go thou and do likewise. You know, you have to read the Bible as a whole. You can't just take a sentence here and there. And that's the Constitution, and reading it as a whole and understanding it. So I've taught constitutional law for a long time. And so I sort of almost pushed my way in a bit with 4SA, because I believed very strongly in what they're doing, because what they're doing is defending liberty, the liberty of people to practice their religion. And so they fought for, because they, in 2013, they did a survey, and we were deemed the second most religiously free country in the world. And I don't know, I think our government took it as some sort of challenge, because since then they've been trying to pass every kind of legislation to restrict the church. And of course, closing the church in 2020, when they had opened restaurants, theaters, which would include bars and even casinos, but they closed the church, and on the flimsiest of evidence. So I've done various cases. I consulted on the spanking case. I was very much the driver behind the case against closing the churches. On the evening we launched an application to be heard on the 2nd of February 2021, and on the evening that night, I think it was the 1st of February at 8 o'clock, Cyril Ramaphosa reopened the churches. So we felt we had at least achieved that. They then closed the churches in June, July, and then we had our matter heard in November, and we lost on the basis that it was all moot. We took it to the SCA and lost there also. It's now gone to the Constitutional Court. But to me, it's incredibly damaging precedent to leave on our law books, that restaurants can be opened. And ironically, they closed it on the 28th or 29th of January, of December 2020. And the 1st of January, I drove into Plettenberg Bay, and every restaurant in that whole town was packed to the hilt. Yes. But we have a 2,000-seater building where if you put 50 people in, it looks like there's 10, There's so much space, but we couldn't meet, but people could be packed in like sardines into restaurants. So I must admit, I think that the evidence they used was extremely flimsy. The way that they treated some of the churches who took a stand against it is reprehensible. Yes. And so I think it's important that we stand up to this sort of thing. A lot of, my dad was a man of action. So so if something happened, he would do something about it, or he would just not at all. So often we would have a discussion, make a decision, and while we're talking, he's dialing to tell people what we're doing, And so I've always believed that you have to get involved. People, yes. I can't remember who said this. I think it was Mark Twain. Say people who stick in the middle of the road get run over. So you can't. I think that there are issues that are too big to stand aside and wait. You have to get involved. For instance, I got involved with a fight with corruption here in Port Elizabeth, and I heard how they were mistreating the city manager, Dr. Lindiwe, because she took a stand against corruption. One night they dumped a whole lot of feces on her stoop, and they were shining lights into her house. Her and her 2 kids, she's a single mom, were hiding under the lintels. They were patrolling with guns, and I decided either have to do something about this or immigrate. Because to be honest, you can't allow this sort of evil to take root, because that's how it happens. And so if we don't act now, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse.
It's interesting you are involved with constitutional law, and the one thing that South Africa prides itself on is the most liberal constitution in the world.
Yeah, so it's a good constitution in many ways,
Yes.
and it saved us during Zuma, to be honest. And the Lord raised up Mogoeng, and
Yeah.
and they used the constitution to defeat what was essentially a coup. You know,
Yes,
he
yes.
was he was he was handing over power to the Guptas and
Right.
authority, and the constitution protected us there. So there are lots of very good mechanisms in it. The issues are, though, when you go look at certain provisions that were written into the constitution. So like the issue of abortion is sadly over because of the constitution. We would have to change the constitution to achieve that. Also, gay rights and spanking and things like that are all largely settled by the constitution before you ever get to court. And so where 4SA had been focusing on fighting individual cases, they've moved their focus very much to lobbying against bad legislation. So against the hate speech bill, which would have badly restricted freedom for people to preach the truth, and other bills like that. So, and they've been very successful. We think that we've been able to push the hate speech bill at the very least into the next parliament. And I think that there's big changes, busy fighting the issues of comprehensive sexual education. They're teaching grade 4s, I think, how to masturbate. I mean, it's if you get on the sidelines here, you're going to there's worse things coming down the road. And the problem, one of the things that people don't realize is that at the same, for instance, we were able to defeat the Papuda amendments. Papuda is already a bad law, in my humble opinion. And they wanted to make it even worse and even more draconian. And through 4SA and DSA, we got over 250,000 submissions against it. And that was an example of people actually doing something. But similar legislation was proposed in, I think, Namibia, Zambia, and England at exactly the same time. And as far as I understand, at least some of those countries it went through. So this is not South Africa. This is a global agenda driven by UN to restrict, to protect some parts of the society at the expense of the rest of society. And so this is happening everywhere. So I'm a NIMBY, not in my backyard, you know. We can't allow that to happen in South Africa. We have to stand against this.
So we have the legal fraternity, and I know you as a man of God, obviously a pastor, leader. What would you say the connection between the passing of these laws and opening the spirit realm to all kinds of perversion? You know, if the sexuality bill, I mean, look at our children, and how would that impact our cities? How would that impact families? How would that impact, the education system? Because there's a definite, can you explain to us the connection between the passing of the law and the opening of the spiritual realm? Because I know that even in your own city, you are very much involved in prayer, which we'll talk about this now, and you have a real understanding of the spirit realm over a nation, over a city, etc.
So you need to read several scriptures together. So Psalm 82 tells us that there's a council in heaven, that and it tells us how God calls these spiritual beings and rebukes them for what they're doing, that they're favoring the rich and oppressing the poor. They are bringing evil. And the reason they can do that is because this is where I think that Christians make a big mistake, is they lay everything on Adam and Eve, and we spend ages arguing about whether it's Adam and Eve or Eve or both. But the bottom line is actually there were three falls. So the first fall is Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
They brought sin. Then in Genesis 6, 1-5, it speaks about how supernatural beings came down on earth and had sex with the woman and produced children.
Yeah.
And that's connected to the spread of evil. So Adam and Eve had brought sin, but it was the supernatural beings that brought evil became so predominant that God actually grieved that he'd ever made humans. And then the third and final fall was in Genesis 11, where God had told them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and spread out. And they say at the Tower of Babel, let's stick together. Let's build a name for ourselves, and I think there's a very good argument to be made that one of the purposes of the Tower of Babel was to build above the flood line. Yeah. In other words, to escape God's judgment, even though God had promised he'd never send a judgment in that regard ever again. So it was a total, utter repudiation of God. And so effectively what God then did is he divorced the nations, and he handed over the nations over to these supernatural beings. Paul teaches us at Mars Hill that the reason why God did this is that he handed them over in the same way that the father gave the prodigal son his inheritance. So some would return to him. And so then we see it was because of the rebellion in Genesis 11 that God then divides the peoples of the earth into nations. And Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 and 9 teaches us that he handed them over to according to the number in his heavenly court, in his council. And he handed over to them, and these principalities and powers then usurped or rejected God's authority and started to oppress these nations and misuse them, because of course it's only God, Jehovah Yahweh, who is perfect and doesn't abuse his powers. And so what we have these nations being ruled by these principalities and powers. And we can see that what happens is that I think it's Ezekiel 30, no, it's not Ezekiel 37, but in Ezekiel, and in Isaiah 14, there's a description of Lucifer, or as we call him, but the prime evil. And especially in Ezekiel, it starts off with a description of the Prince of Tyre. And then at some point it goes into a description of the supernatural being that was in the Garden of Eden, the mountain of God. And you can't tell really where Ezekiel's talking about one and the other, because what happens is these supernatural beings start to integrate themselves so with the leaders that you can barely tell who's who, is it the supernatural being? Is it the actual king of Tyre? Who knows? And actually, frankly, who cares? They end up being completely controlled by these principalities and powers. And so that's why I preached a message at Faith Fellowship, our conference, why Jacob Zuma looks like Pierre Botha.
Yes, because, I listened to that.
Because
very good.
Because ultimately the principality and power is still in charge. And so it may be a black man, it may be a white man, but ultimately they become integrated into the prince and doing what that spirit prince does. And we know that they're spirit princes because in Daniel it describes a spirit prince over Greece and of Persia, and that's in Daniel 10. And then it speaks of Michael as the prince over Israel. Now, if you look at that, you see that we can say that there's spirit princes over countries, that God had handed power over them. And then Colossians 2 verses, I think it's 15, 16, 17, somewhere around there, says that Jesus, he nailed the legal ordinances against us and removed the legal rights. And so what Jesus did on the cross is he removed the legal rights that these princes had over the nations. The problem is that we still listen, our nations really mostly listen to these spirit princes. We don't follow God. And so what Jesus said in Matthew 28, 18 to 20, is that he then tells us to go and disciple nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all that that he has told them. And so what we have to do is de facto, legal term, in fact. Most nations still live under the rule of those spirit princes. De jure, they no longer have the legal right, but the peoples of the world continue to obey these spirit princes, and rather than God. And so Ephesians 2 verse 1 to 3 says that all those who don't live in obedience to God live in obedience to the prince of the power of the air. And so they use culture and law and every other area of life to literally control the peoples of the earth. So then we have Matthew 12 verse 25 teaches us that that this kingdom is totally united against the human race. In fact, I believe that if you go back to Genesis 3, what Satan was trying to do in Genesis 3 was assassinate the human race at source. So because God had said, if you eat this, you will die. And so he was trying to kill off the human race then and there, right there in the garden. What they didn't take into account are two things. First, what he didn't take into account is, first of all, the grace of God. And secondly, God's promises that he will not punish. He will only visit the sins to the third and fourth generation. So if the human race had died out there, effectively the fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th generation would have been wiped out. And so that would go against God's nature to limit the length of punishment. And he says, I will bless to 1,000 generations. And so what God did is, because Adam and Eve died, Satan in a sense succeeded, but Satan didn't know that God would push the sentence out for 900 years, and so they could produce a human race. And so Satan runs a kingdom that Jesus teaches in Matthew 12, 25 to 29 is completely united. And its goal is to kill, steal, and destroy. And it also, Matthew 12, 25 teaches us that Satan has authority, or his structures are built around kingdoms, cities, and households. So he has three levels of truth. And so they fight. So their goal is to control kingdoms, cities, and households.